Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining. Welcome to our webinar on understanding Chromebook security. Before we dive into this, I just want to kind of lay a few of the ground rules. Feel free to submit any questions you might have in the chat menu. And also, this webinar is recorded, and we will be sending you an email within 48 hours so that you can always watch the recording. And that's if you've registered, obviously. So, and the last thing is certainly follow us on Twitter and stay up to date with some of our news. All right. So as we go forward here, the presenters today, myself, Steve Banda, Senior Manager of Security Solutions at Lookout, and Andy Olpen, Sales Engineer at Lookout. Andy brings a lot of experience. He's been here quite some time. So thank you, Andy, for joining us. And to cover the agenda briefly. So today's agenda, we are going to first give you a little bit of a background about Lookout, in case you're not familiar with who we are. And then we're going to move into Chrome OS security, and then start to peel back the onion a bit and look at some of the security gaps or areas of, for improvement for Chrome OS security, app threats, phishing, and network threats specifically. And then we're going to wrap it up by talking a little bit about the integration we have with Google and how this can help you protect your organization. So with that, I'm going to jump into a little of the fun stuff, which is kind of bragging a little bit about Lookout. Not much, just a tiny bit, so if you can bear with me. But just in terms of giving you a little bit of the background, we have a pretty interesting history in mobile security. Back in 2004, three security researchers from the University of Southern California actually discovered a Bluetooth vulnerability in a Nokia 6310. So they took this to Nokia, who really didn't have an interest in addressing that vulnerability because they said the range was too short. It would only go up to like 10 to 100 meters. So the founders actually created a little device called the Blue Sniper that could actually steal a signal from retrieve a Bluetooth signal from, I think, over a mile. And they showcased this at the Academy Awards a few years later, and were able to retrieve a bunch of celebrity information. So this was a pretty awesome publicity stunt. And following this, they really founded in 2007 Lookout. So that since then, they grew the user base through a personal application to 45 million users in around 2013. We realized, wow, look at this tremendous value we have because of the data that we've amassed. We could do a lot of good in the enterprise as well. So today we have a strong enterprise offering, and that's really been great for us and for businesses looking to secure mobile devices. We have a footprint of 200 million devices worldwide and over 120 million apps. So we're really seeing every app binary out there. And it's the data that we really are very proud of, which allows us to be extremely effective with our security offerings. And as you can see from this map as well, we do have a global footprint to serve our customer base wherever they are. So the next thing I want to cover here, which is really core to what we're doing today, is it's important to understand our relationship and our history with Google as we go forward and talk about Chromebook security. So we've had a long-standing partnership with Google. It started back in 2007. As I mentioned, we were really the innovators in the mobile security space. So we were the first to have a personal mobile security app that would run on Android. And you can see that we really evolve our relationship, across these kind of 5 buckets you see on the left, but one being security intelligence, which is very interesting. So every time Lookout discovers a new mobile threat, we would always notify Google before we would publish any statements publicly. And so this led us to actually do some joint research with Google in 2016 around a big discovery we had, which was called Pegasus. So this was a big deal. It helped evolve our relationship even further. And ultimately, Google wanted to secure all the applications that they have in the Google Play Store. So they started working on an alliance with us. We had discussions around how could we formalize this. And then at the same time, we started to discuss integrations with Google. Well, how can we protect your productivity suite, which is previously G Suite, today called Google Workspace, which was recently renamed. So in working with Google, really ultimately came up with a very good Android enterprise solution. We helped them design the Android, had input into the design of the Android enterprise solution, which will support work and personal devices. And then a key piece here was that in 2019 we discovered a BayTAD, which is basically delivered malicious plugins to over 200 Android apps that were in the Play Store. These apps had around 4 million downloads, so this was a real problem. So we were able to notify Google about this. They took down the impacted apps immediately. So, as you could tell, we really have a strong, long history with Google, really based on a lot of trust. So we're very, very excited to continue our involvement with Google into the future, and with the future developments around Google Cloud, and making Lookout more available. So with that, what I want to do is I want to actually just emphasize when we talk about Chromebooks and what is going on in the market with Chromebooks. So it may have taken a little time to get here, but now we're seeing that Chromebooks are really being widely adopted. And part of this is there's been obviously major improvements in the security of Chromebooks, which makes them very attractive. They're easy to use. The push to remote work, they're affordable. So all these factors. And so what we have is, you can just see here a couple quick stats to show the trend is Gartner has provided information saying that they now represent an estimated 11% of the personal computer market. That's pretty massive. And Canalys also showcases some of the growth that they've seen from last year, quarter Q3 of 2020 compared to the same quarter last year, 122% growth. So definitely a big trend for Chromebooks. So we're very happy to be able to have a solution that can help us secure those devices even more. So with that, what I would like to do now is kind of dig into a bit of the detail. I'm going to turn it over to Andy to take us through Chrome OS security and the different components. Andy?
Thanks, Steve. So Chrome OS started out as really an operating system based on the Chrome browser, right? The idea was that most of the work you needed to do, you could do in the browser. So why not give you an operating system that didn't require as much management? Chromebooks have automatic updates to ensure that the devices are running the latest version, which for those of you who are in the traditional enterprise space, know can be a big problem for like Windows environments where you have to manage the patching and the updates that go along with that. Chrome automatically includes sandboxing, so web pages each run in their own restricted environments. And every time the Chromebook starts up, there's a verified boot process, which makes sure that the bootloader hasn't been corrupted. So very similar to what you see with most mobile devices today. And the user has an option to do a self-repair and install a clean version of the operating system. And again, because this is all based on the web browser, there's no data stored locally. It's all stored in the cloud. Any data that has to be stored locally, which doesn't happen very often, is encrypted, which again ensures safety. And the recovery mode lets you get back to a known good version. So all in all, it's a straightforward operating system. It's easy to manage. It's much less likely to have troubles with things like ransomware or issues where the device doesn't work. Steve, you can skip on to the next one, please. Now, that being said, there are definitely some things where we could look at how Chrome OS could potentially be a little better than it is today. So one of the things that Google added within Chrome OS is the ability to install Android apps on your Chrome device. This greatly expanded the options for the end users for how they use their Chromebooks. You can install all your favorite apps. You can install office automation apps. You can install cloud apps. You can install games. But that also opened the possibility that those Android apps do not behave as nicely as we might hope. And like any other computing device today, they're also vulnerable to phishing attacks. Those phishing attacks sometimes are to install the aforementioned malicious Android apps, but they are also to potentially steal credentials or trick the user into doing something they should.
Seems like maybe we've lost it.
Then all of the Chrome devices, of course, attached to a network. So when you have devices like portable Chromebooks that could potentially go to coffee houses or hotels, you have the potential for somebody trying to do some form of network attack. And those network attacks might be in the form of presenting fake TLS certificates to do man in the middle. It could be a downgrade attack, but the idea there is to interfere with the proper functioning of the network and be able to break the security of the communication. And finally, this is a Chrome specific thing we've seen on both Chromebooks and the Chrome browser, is malicious extensions on top of Chrome. Where Chrome has a bunch of extensions available for end users to customize their experience, sometimes those extensions don't behave in a way that is respectful of security and might potentially steal information because the extensions have access to everything in the browser. If that extension is malicious, it can get things like passwords and access to the decrypted content that happens on the end user's device. So that's another thing to keep in mind.
Thanks, Andy. That's a really good summary of the gaps. What I'd like to do now is I just want to probably transition a little bit into drilling into each type of threat. And I think what we'll do here is we'll start with app threats. App threats, from a data perspective, what Lookout is really experiencing is we're showing encounter rates of an average of, over the last year, an average around 3.4 for the last 4 quarters, with really no major swings. So it's been relatively consistent. I mean, you see a slight, sort of a downward trend, but it's not significant enough to predict that there is a downward trend. So I think important behind this data, really contributing to this, is there's a higher app threat encounter rate that we see across the personal user base, and that average is around 3.3%, with the enterprise users a little bit below 1%. So this is likely due to potentially greater control over apps and apps that are allowed to be run in the enterprise devices or within the enterprises. But I think what's an important takeaway here is, especially as there's been a broader shift to bring your own device, is it lends a good view into that potential for BYOD to introduce a little bit more app risk as employees are allowed to use their personal devices for whatever they want. So I think that's an important takeaway here, and it's important to understand that still at 3%, that can pose a significant risk to an organization with a number of users. The other piece of this is, as you can see, there's a bit of a breakdown in terms of the type of threats by volume that we see. And you can see there's a large proportion here attributed to riskware. What I'd like to do now is just plug Andy in a little bit more to highlight a few of these areas that might be useful for the audience.
So when you look at riskware here, riskware is interesting because it's a very wide percentage. Now, when it comes to Android apps, we see riskware in a couple of different ways. Sometimes we'll see that in an application that exposes personal information and doesn't handle it in a secure method. So we're a little concerned about the riskiness of the app. We also see that sometimes where application developers may lose control of their signing certificate, which means that an application signed by that certificate could be malicious, and somebody who is in a bad position might have re-signed that to do something that you don't expect. We also see a lot of adware. And what we mean by adware is an application that isn't attempting to steal data. It's not doing anything malicious. It's just trying to generate revenue by throwing ads at you. So it's that really annoying app that every time you turn on your device, there's an ad that came from nowhere. You don't know why it's there. But you also see we have things like root enablers and Trojans. And this is starting to get into the more malicious stuff. This is stuff that's trying to steal your data, that's trying to steal your banking data, that's trying to grab credentials, that's trying to root your device and see what other access they can get based on the networks they're connected to.
And so, Andy, I think what would be great now is if you wouldn't mind diving a little bit deeper, we can look at a couple of the specific Android app threats that Lookout's really issued guidance for over the last year.
Sure. So the first one, this one is pretty recent. There was a vulnerability in Chrome, and this particular vulnerability applied across the board. So it was a vulnerability in Chrome for Windows, it was a vulnerability in Chrome for Android and iOS, vulnerability for Chrome in Chromebooks. And anytime you have a browser vulnerability, it's potentially an issue, because the browser vulnerabilities can be used when a user goes to a bad site or gets a phishing attack that directs them to a bad site that can potentially lead to code execution, which can then be turned around and turned into a ransomware or some other kind of attack. So what we told our customers was gave them information about how it works and recommendations to upgrade to the latest version of Chrome, which is a fairly standard release in situations like this. But it's important to understand that these kind of vulnerabilities don't exist just on Windows and Mac devices, right? The mobile devices and the Chromebooks still need to be updated and managed in the same way. We also put out a information advisory a little further back to our customers about TikTok. And TikTok wasn't necessarily malicious. It wasn't trying to infiltrate corporate networks, but there were some privacy issues around the handling of data and where it sent that data. So we wanted to make sure our customers understood that their mobile devices, that their Chromebooks that had TikTok could potentially be a vector for information about their users and their employees to get to places where it wasn't expected. So these are just the kinds of things we need to keep an eye on all of our devices. And don't forget how much personal data is available on a Chromebook or an iOS or an Android device, because of how much work is starting to be done on these devices.
Thanks, Andy. So I think what might be interesting for the audience is if we take a look at just, we're always being, berated with news stories and breaches in the news. And I came across this one, and I wanted to showcase this a little bit. This is a breach that recently occurred with the Baltimore County Public Schools. So as we know, Chromebooks are being widely used in schools. This was a ransomware attack that forced the closure of remote classes. Unfortunately, all of our students these days, or many of them, are remote. But this is for remote students. I think it was like over 100 or around 115,000 students in the Baltimore County Public School system. So this attack affected the district's websites, remote learning programs, even grading and email systems. But what was most interesting here is that the Chromebooks were regarded as being unaffected. So the security built into Chromebooks was such that this ransomware was not able to impact them. So the advice here, as you can see, was not to use Windows-based devices, but Chromebooks are okay. And I showcase this one because I think it helps highlight the security that's been built in well into the Chrome OS operating system, which is excellent. But even so, and the reason we're here today, obviously, is to talk about the fact that every system has vulnerabilities, and there's certainly a need to add a layer of security. So what I'd like to do now is move to an actual kind of showcase a protection in the form of an actual demo. So this is a little bit of a video script that I'll turn over to Andy to kind of take us through. So let's see here. Just give it a moment. All right, so Andy, I'll hit go and let you.
Yeah, go ahead. This is a kind of a boring video until it isn't. So again, because Chromebooks support Android apps, users can install Android apps, and there is an option to install Android apps from unknown sources, which means you can get them from outside the protections of Google Play, and that's where a lot of the malicious apps come from. So you see in the lower right, a little pop-up came, a removable device was detected. So what I've done is just taken an SD card with a bunch of pieces of malware on it, right? So this is a pretty normal scenario, right? If I'm attempting to be an attacker, I might put a USB fobs and hope somebody picks them up and plugs them into their computer. So you see what's going on here is lookouts on the Chromebook, and it's monitoring the state of the device at all times. And that includes the file system. So as soon as I've plugged in this SD card or I plugged in this USB dongle, we scan the file system to make sure there's nothing on it that could potentially harm the Chromebook. And we're detecting all these different APK files on the file system. Now note, in this video, I haven't installed any of them, right? I haven't even gotten to that point. We're detecting and telling the user that stuff needs to be deleted and removed so that the threats never installed in the operating system and never becomes risk.
Great, thanks for taking us through that. So hopefully that gives you everybody a pretty good little bit of insight into app threats and how they can really present an issue on Chromebooks. I think that video really does help give us a little bit more of a imagery around the actual potential attack and detection. So what I'd like to do now is I think moving on to phishing threats is very important. So most attacks actually do start with phishing, and I think this is something that everyone in the audience fortunately knows about phishing. We probably all know that as individuals around the holidays, throughout the pandemic, phishing attacks have been top of mind. We all know that we have to look at our emails very carefully. When it comes to mobile devices, we actually have to look at text messages as well. We have to understand the apps and the web pages we are going to. So what I want to show here is that we see if we look at the encounter rates that Lookout experiences, we're reporting an average near 10% for the past year. But you can see that there was a spike near around 17%. And this is reflecting our enterprise and personal user base. Because at the end of the day, we all have devices in our hands, and that's we are targets. So like as I mentioned, that spike in the first quarter, as you can all imagine, was really due to the early days of the pandemic, and then a slight leveling after that. But it's interesting, and in fact, in April, Google reported that they detected 18 million daily malware and phishing emails related to COVID. So it's really a massive problem, and what I'd like to showcase here too, and it really doesn't matter what device you're on. I mean, phishing is phishing. In some cases, the applications that you're running can draw attention. And I think this slide here, what I just want to show briefly is that across the productivity apps, namely Google Workspace, which are obviously main point of this discussion today, but as well as Microsoft Office 365, we are seeing high rates of phishing. And we need these productivity apps to get our work done. Cyber criminals know this, so they target these. They target users that are using these productivity apps because they know that that's a very easy way to gain access to a lot of sensitive data for organizations, businesses, schools, etc. And so it's just important to realize that an phishing encounter rate of 14% on average is pretty high, and with a range on Google Workspace of being from 11% to 17% at the height of the pandemic. So just want to be clear, by encounters, these are the detections that Lookout, just like we saw in the video, is detecting, even though that was an app threat. So if these encounters are left unattended or undetected, rather, that's pretty significant and can really be a serious problem. So very important to keep this in mind as we go forward, seeing that the use of Google Workspace on Chromebooks is often very much in play. So what I want to do now is just give you another example, and this is pretty interesting. When we talk about Lookout discoveries, this is maybe one of my favorites that I like to showcase in terms of when we think about phishing, because it's sophisticated in the respect that it's targeting banks. So earlier this year, Lookout's phishing AI solution, which is what we call our artificial intelligence phishing engine, it scans the web, crawls for all sorts of information so that we can be early in detecting phishing attacks that are targeting specific organizations. So we discovered this phishing campaign that was targeting a lot of well-known banks based in Canada and America. So these banks are well-known, and the objective was to lure these banks to fake websites or lure the users to fake websites. This campaign spread through primarily SMS messages. As you can see in this image, the goal was to mirror the login pages of these banks in an effort to really capture the banking credentials and other sensitive login information of the mobile users. So I think there were 200 phishing pages that were associated with this campaign. over nearly 4,000 unique IP addresses, which would indicate the size of the user base that could have been impacted, and that was over a 7-month period. So this attack was pretty significant. We were able to detect this and notify the banks in advance so that they could actually issue a takedown. One thing I think is important is we do mention that this happened over SMS, but there are applications where you can receive text messages on your Chromebook. So as we fluidly move from mobile to Chromebooks and back, this is certainly a relevant situation to keep in mind. And it's very hard to detect a fake login screen from a real one. It's actually extremely difficult. Now to look at phishing in the news, and I kind of chose this image because I think it's an interesting one that we can all associate with. We all probably want to be on that ship right now or vacationing somewhere that looks like this. But this past March, Carnival Corporation, they announced 2 of their cruise lines had suffered an email phishing attack. They just reported it took them actually 9 months to report this, and that's possibly because they had to, a lot of legwork to do, a lot of investigation and handling policies and so forth before they actually declared this. But according to the press release, this was deceptive emails were sent to employees, which ultimately allowed a third party to access email accounts and expose personal information such as social security numbers, government IDs such as passports, national identity cards, even credit card and financial account information, and actually even health-related information. So this was very pervasive in terms of stealing information. And the terrible thing is this just happened again. So on August 15th, they were hit again with another attack. So my point here is once unfortunately you suffer a breach, a lot of your personal information is obtained. That information, it can be re-leveraged in the future. So it really starts to highlight the impact and the potential for recurrence of phishing attacks and attacks. So, Andy, do you have anything to add on this particular phishing in the news piece?
The most important thing here is, kind of like you said, that quote at the bottom was part of their press release or one of their discussions for the August breach, where one of the brands that are part of Carnival was affected by this piece of ransomware. But their IT security department was pretty clear and said, we don't know if other brands might be affected. There's no assurance that. And if ransomware gets deployed deeply enough and the attacker gets in far enough, it's very difficult to root them out. So it's one of those things that it's important to make sure that all of the potential methods where an attacker could get in, we're hardening as much as possible. And all too often, the assumption is that a Chromebook or an Android device or an iOS device, I don't have to worry about those devices. Those devices are hardened enough, it's fine. And we forget about things like if I hit a phishing link on my Chromebook and give up my ID and password, or we have definitely seen some phishing attacks that are not only looking for ID and password, but want ID, password, and 2-factor authentication tokens. So if they're on the ball enough and the user gives up their 2-factor code and the attacker's ready to go, you can potentially get around multi-factor as well. It's harder. It absolutely does make these attacks more difficult, but it's not impossible to get around, which is why phishing has to be one of those things we keep an eye on all our endpoints to try to reduce the effectiveness of any campaigns trying to steal credentials.
Thanks, Andy. And since your previous video was so engaging, what I'd like to do is invite you to pretty much showing a phishing detection and how Lookout does that. I'll play this video.
So very similar to the last video. What you're going to see is we have a Chromebook and it's doing its normal thing, browsing in Chrome, full screen browser, and we're going to attempt to go to a malicious website. Now, in this case, it's a YCAR, a test website. We're not actually trying to go to someplace bad, but you can see the user experience when we try to go to that. Now, in the lower right corner, you get a notification that says, hey, Lookout blocked this malicious content. Now, the user has an option to proceed anyway. That's configurable by policy. So you as the administrator can decide whether or not the user gets the option to continue or whether the user is just simply blocked and not allowed to continue to something malicious. Again, the hope here is that we're giving you another layer of defense on top of what Chrome OS already brings to make it that much more difficult for an attacker to convince your end users to give up their credentials to a bad website.
All right, thank you. And I think now, this is a good point to move into the next threat. We've talked so far. We've covered app threats. We've covered phishing threats, and those two often work hand in hand. Where phishing attacks will actually often deposit malware, take advantage of vulnerabilities in applications. I want to now turn to a threat that's less it's less prevalent from what we see, and it makes sense that it is. But what I want to do here is, and I'm going to ask Andy to kind of take us through a little bit more of network threats so that we can get a better understanding and visualize really how these occur and would have to occur. But from a detection or encounter rate standpoint, we see low detection rates across the board. So when we're providing guidance, when we're talking about defenses, network threats tend to take lower precedence because of the lower encounter rates that we see. Andy, do you have anything to add to this piece in terms of the encounter rates around network threats?
Yeah, absolutely. When you talk about network threats, so we're going to talk a little bit on the next slide here about what we mean by network threats. But the challenge behind network threats is typically you've got to be located somewhere nearby to be able to do some kind of network attack. Now, it certainly happens that people may hang out in coffee shops and attempt to grab network information from your devices, but what we consider a network attack is a real, honest network attack. And it's not necessarily something where just because a user connects to a Starbucks network, we don't want to send an alert on that, because that's not an attack, and you as an administrator can get overwhelmed with notifications for stuff like that. Now, what does a man-in-the-middle attack look like? The idea here is usually that, I as an attacker go set up at a Starbucks, and I will have a fake Wi-Fi network, and I try to convince the mobile devices to connect to it. Now, once a mobile device or a Chromebook connects to my network, now because I am the one providing the network, I can do some games with the security communication back and forth. I can potentially introduce my own certificate so I can decrypt all the traffic. I could put a proxy in there to see where you're going. I might downgrade the security in the TLS protocol, but all the goal here is the same, right? I want to be able to see what you're communicating and what you're communicating about. And our goal is to make sure that anytime anyone's playing any of these games that could potentially compromise your security of the data going back and forth, we're alerting the user. So this is the first time we've really talked about something we call the Lookout Security Cloud. Now, Lookout Security Cloud is our name for our cloud-based machine learning. And because of all the devices that Steve talked about earlier, all the devices we run on, all the different traffic we inspect, all the different things we feed into our machine learning engine, we can get a good idea about what kind of behavior is acceptable and what kind of behavior is suspicious. So when your Chromebook goes and attempts to connect to a network, and you're presented with, in this case, a bad certificate, what we'll do is we will probe the network as soon as the network changes. And if we see anything funny, like I mentioned in the last slide, the TLS downgrade attacks or bad certificates, by connecting to some of our reference servers. If we connect to our reference servers or some other random servers on the internet and we see any of these issues occur, we can generate an alert, tell the user to disconnect. We can also even shut down internet communications until the user disconnects to make sure that none of your sensitive data goes across that compromised network.
Thank you. I think what I'd like to do now is, so I think the takeaway for the audience really, and it's probably something that everybody is already familiar with, but because we all do connect to public Wi-Fi from here and there, whether we're in an airport or Starbucks, is really ensure that you're connecting to the right network. I mean, these things do happen, and so it's just, even though the encounter rates tend to be lower, it's just good to be vigilant. So what I'd like to do now is we wrap up. So we've covered app threats, phishing threats, network threats. what I'd like to do is just kind of tie it all together. And Andy, if you don't mind, I'd like to have you take us through just kind of recapping our protections and then show the audience how we, an integration that we have with Google and how we can protect their organizations.
Sure. So as we said, our goal on Chrome OS is to do three different things. We're scanning the Android apps so that we know that the apps themselves are not a threat to your privacy. They're not attempting to steal data. They're not attempting to break security on the device. That you can be confident that the apps installed on the device are secure. We have an additional layer of protection in our phishing and content protection, which ensures that when a user clicks on a link or when a user visits a website, if they're visiting a malicious website or they're clicking a malicious link, they will be blocked from going to that website. This reduces the chance that your Chromebook is infected or broken in some way that compromises the security, or that the user potentially exposes their credentials that can be used as an attack against the company. And finally, we are protecting the network to ensure that the Chromebook, whatever wireless network the Chromebook is connecting over, is secure and is not attempting to steal information in transit as the Chromebook connects back to the company, and that all of the data is getting to where it needs to be without being interfered with.
Great, and I think what's really interesting is we start with a platform that's already relatively secure. Then we incorporate mobile security from Lookout, and so then we really put a bow on it essentially with the integration to Google Workspace, which we call continuous conditional access to kind of describe really accurately what is happening here. So, Andy, you mind just kind of taking us through how this works?
Yeah, so the idea behind continuous conditional access is that Lookout is continually monitoring the security state of your device. And your access to corporate resources, such as Google Workspace, is only allowed if the device is in a good security state. So the employees accessing Google Workspace from their device, and we have an integration with Google Cloud Identity. So Google Cloud Identity is always getting the latest information about the security state of the device from the aforementioned Lookout Security Cloud. The admin sets policies and they say, okay, this is the amount of risk I'm willing to accept. So if the user ends up in a situation where the risk is too high, the admin can decide what that looks like. Now, if the device is safe, the user is allowed access to Google Workspace. This also gives you a great way to ensure that all of the devices are protected with Lookout. So if the user comes along and picks up their kid's school Chromebook that isn't protected by Lookout and they attempt to log into Google Workspace will not have access to any security data and can block access. Similarly, if the Chromebook has any kind of security threat, if they've installed some kind of malicious application, if they're on a network that's compromised, we can block access to Google Workspace. Again, the idea is to make sure that the device is secured and not compromised before they get access to that work data, which helps us reduce the likelihood that an attacker can take the information or their access on a Chromebook to get into additional internal systems and move laterally and start to deploy other payloads or steal other data. And that's really the goal here, is to make sure that if they're accessing work data, they're doing it from a secure device.
Excellent. Thank you, Andy. So with that, I think we're actually now at a point where we've covered the majority of the presentation. We'd like to restate a few key takeaways so that we can summarize this well and allow you to leave with some good points and good information fresh on the top of your mind. So first is, why add security to Chromebooks? I hope we've helped answer that. But really, organizations are, as we know, we're remote. So we're allowing our users to work outside of our traditional trusted perimeter. We also leverage cloud-based applications such as Google Workspace, as we saw previously. The productivity apps remain a target, and this allows us really to have the freedom for BYOD to be secure, to access, to have peace of mind, to work where we need to work. So if we take one item at a time here, Chromebooks contain multiple layers of security. This makes them really an attractive option for businesses and schools. We've seen this with the adoption and the uptake, but we do know that there are gaps and there's ways around security. So adding mobile security to Chromebooks will really make a very robust, excellent solution. So we do recommend this. It'll help protect against the malicious apps, the phishing, and the network threats that we've taken you through. And it's also going to give you real-time visibility into the incidents on Chrome OS that can be potentially impacting you. So as we saw previously, our phishing AI capability allows us to often provide real-time information into threats that are targeting the organization. And again, privacy, we didn't touch on that much, but that's a core element whenever you're deploying or securing mobile devices that are either personal or even work, but are BYOD. This is very important. None of us really want to, as our personal and work lives blend and come together and intersect around these devices. We don't want our employer knowing everything we're doing. It's a very personal device, so this is central. And Lookout achieves this. We only really ask for an email address when we're providing an activation. So the last thing, a couple last pieces here. Yeah, again, so related to the BYOD, it's going to help you enable and roll out flexible programs. But lastly, it's important to have, when you're thinking about Chromebooks and leveraging Chromebooks and adding a layer of security, you need to ensure that security provider has a strong partnership with Google so that you get the best, robust, and comprehensive protection today, but also into the future. Because as we know, technology moves fast, cyber criminals move even faster. So there's a constant race. We need to keep up, and we need to ensure that relationship is sound and that we are moving in lockstep towards advancing security and innovations around mobile security and Chrome security. So those are the key takeaways I have for you. That does bring us to any questions that you guys might have in the audience. We'll take a few minutes here and let a couple questions go.
Yeah, and I see there's a question about Chrome OS versus Chromebook. You're correct. We've been using those terms a bit interchangeably, but what we mean is any Chrome OS device.
And I see another one here, kind of corporate controls like website or domain whitelisting or website category blocking are available. Andy, that could be a good one for you.
Yes, so we support the ability to do actually all of those things. We can do website whitelisting, blacklisting, and in addition to blocking malicious content, we have an option for blocking offensive content, where we can filter out things like adult content, violent content, or criminal content, so that if the Chromebook is meant, or the Chrome OS device, let me be more clear about that, is meant to be used for only specific work purposes, we can reduce the chances that they're going to something that is potentially offensive.
And then Andy, I'm gonna send you another one here. I think it's a good question that's interesting, but we talk. I think see that there's a question around Android apps. So we're typically comfortable downloading Android apps to our mobile devices. But what about Chromebooks? They support Android apps. They support all Android apps. Is there any insight you can give to the audience around Chromebook support?
Chrome OS and Android are very similar to your Android phone, right? So the idea is that your Chrome OS device has the Google Play Store, and you can install Android apps from Google Play on your Chrome OS device. It also supports the same capabilities like trusting installation from unknown sources, which is how some attackers will get malicious apps onto your device. In Chrome OS, it almost behaves like a separate part of the device, is kind of how it feels, where there's a kind of an Android overlay on top of the traditional Chrome browser. But it has access to the system, it can save data, and it has the potential to affect the operating of the Chrome OS device in general if something goes wrong with one of those Android devices, or if there is an attacker there.
Okay, excellent.
So I see a question about how much management is necessary by the business. One of our goals in creating our solution is to try to reduce the amount of management. And what I mean by that is, if we detect an issue, so let's say one of your end users installs a malicious Android app on their Chrome OS device. We will detect that, we'll let the administrator know. We will automatically begin the process with things like our integration with Google Workspaces and Google Cloud Identity to restrict access from all of the work, applications, and data, right? No admins required for any of that. And the same thing happens on the reverse side. When the user uninstalls that malicious application, access is automatically restored. That issue within our console is marked as resolved without any admin interference. So it's very, very straightforward. And we do the same thing with our implementation for website blocking for offensive content. So the administrator is absolutely not involved in categorizing what websites are considered adult or violent or criminal. That's done automatically. All that the administrator does is check a box that says, I want to block adult content. And we take care of all of the categorization and stuff on the back end.
And I see one more here that actually looks like you did touch on already in that answer, but it was related to continuous conditional access and our integration with Google Identity. In the example you used earlier, we talked about if someone picks up your Chromebook, they attempt to log into Workspace. If there's a threat on the device, when they attempt to sign in for the first time, they would be blocked from accessing Workspace until that threat has been removed. But what if you're in an active session, you're connected to your workspace, Google Workspace, working on some spreadsheets or documents, and let's just say a threat occurs and is detected. How does Lookout handle that?
It is very similar to what happens when you're logging in the first time. We can log the user out and block them from getting access to the data until the session's resolved. So it isn't a situation where if they're not actively logging in with a problem, we can't stop them. The whole part of continuous conditional access is we can do it from start to finish and make sure that even in the middle of a session, we can still block access.
Right. Thank you. I do see. I think we are getting close on time here, but there's maybe time for one or two more questions. I see one here. Can you talk a bit about your existing user base? Is it primarily in education, or is it a mix of corporate and education customers? And is the use case similar for both verticals? I think it's interesting. I mean, we certainly have a sizable mix of both. We have been very successful in the enterprise space, and so if you can, the way I see this, the way I'd answer this, and Andy, I invite you to add comment. But if you can, provide security for those organizations that are highly targeted because they have intellectual property that has to be detected, or they are under very sensitive. Governed by very sensitive compliance regulations, privacy regulations, then that's really the gold standard. And then from there, the ability to have solutions for BYOD, for Chromebooks, for Android devices, iOS devices. I mean, this is really then moving over to, okay, well, we can certainly continue to address the needs of the education market, which we've done very successfully and continue to do. Andy, I don't know if you have any color to add to that as we close out?
No, I think you covered that pretty well. Our customer base is a very wide swath from small, medium business to education, to enterprise, to government agencies, to very large government agencies and large businesses. So we really cover all kinds of customers, large and small.
Great. I think we're about there. I don't see. I'll give it one more minute. I don't see too many more coming in, but I hope that these questions have been also useful for the audience more broadly, and I hope that we've answered questions and really allowed you to have some good insight into Chromebooks and the security that can be provided and should be provided. So with that, one thing that I would like to mention, and we will kind of wrap up here, is that we do have a number of case studies. So if you are interested in learning more about how Lookout solves these problems for different verticals, different organizations, how we've done it, what the experience has been, you can certainly learn more. You go to our website. We have a lot of information up there. So I encourage you to do that and certainly reach out. So thanks for joining us. Thank you, Andy.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.